We last left off our story on Germany when the Roman Empire had just suffered one of its greatest humiliations at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. The Romans would never again seriously consider annexing Germania. Arminius, leader of the Cherusci and of the German forces at the Teutoburg, did attempt to unify the tribes off the tailwinds of that victory. While they had won a great battle, it had been done through treachery and guerrilla warfare. The Romans would be back, and they would be ready next time. If Arminius hoped to repel this future invasion, he had to make allies fast. In that vein, he sent the head of the slain Roman commander, Varus, to a great Germanic king in the south, who shared a border with Rome along the Danube River. This Germanic king oversaw a vast collection of powerful tribes who were called the Marcomanni. This Marcomannic king, after receiving the head of Varus, sent the head directly back to Rome, so that Varus could be given a proper burial. The Marcomanni had basically told Arminius to shove it, and rejected his alliance offer. They didn't have any interest in creating a pan-Germanic alliance with someone who had won one victory against Rome. They knew that when the time came, any friend of Arminius would also incur the wrath of Rome's legions. History has shown this was a prudent move by the Marcomanni, because Arminius and his allies would be soundly defeated. Before the Romans could capture him, Arminius would be killed by his fellow kinsmen in a power struggle for control. With Arminius' death, the effort to unify Germanic tribes collapsed. Rome declared victory and sent their legions home. It would be another 150 years before the Germans began to question their collective relationship with Rome. The Romans learned from this conflict that conquering Germania was simply not worth the effort, and so instead adopted a defensive policy along their entire border with the Germans. This border was conveniently located at the two largest rivers in Europe, the Rhine and the Danube. This defensive position was not some great wall separating the two worlds, but rather various forts and outposts which created points to control trade. If the Romans couldn't conquer them, they would at least civilize them to hopefully prevent future invasions. The fostering of trade saw great wealth pour into the entirety of the empire. But one often forgotten element of this is that the people Rome were trading with also grew wealthy, albeit at a clipped rate. Trade brought great benefit to the German tribes who began to have access to new resources, technological advances, and other more advanced artisanal methods. For example, many communities converted from wood huts to brick housing, from rudimentary goods to more complex ones offered from a vast Roman trade network. These goods helped to create a more sophisticated German society over time. The Roman forts and outposts became bastions for trade. These soon became towns and eventually cities. These are in fact the birth of many famous German cities of today and are more recognizable by the names that we call them, such as Cologne, Mainz, Trier, and Augsburg. Despite a mutually beneficial trade relationship, there were still conflicts between the tribes and Rome. When Rome was strong, the emperors exerted their influence in Germania through military campaign as an easy way to gain prestige. When Roman power waned, even locally, many tribes took advantage by looting and pillaging the lightly protected Roman settlements. This was often the case when Rome was busy fighting a conflict in another theater of their empire. Even when the empire was strong, it would often be invaded by neighbors across its many borders. Because of this, the Romans relied on a network of allies at their borders to help take control of sticky situations. This benefited Rome, who didn't have to get involved in every petty local dispute, and benefited the allies, who received the backing of Rome in all of their disputes. It also allowed Rome to keep a close ear to the ground. For example, when a local ally could no longer police their own, they would call on Rome to step in and take control before it got out of hand. While the system wasn't perfect, it had helped to mostly maintain peace in Germania. The Marcomanni, after refusing the alliance with Arminius, were from time to time considered one of these local allies with which Rome would call upon to ensure peace in their region. The Marcomanni would often mediate and ensure peace between the tribes and peace between the tribes and Rome. Because of this responsibility, the Marcomanni's influence grew and they became a power broker in the Germanic world. In the 160s AD, the Marcomanni began to look at their relationship with Rome a bit differently. While they had benefited by becoming an ally of Rome, they were continually called upon to do their dirty work. When tribes were fighting, they were often sending their own warriors to put it down. This began the line of questioning around who is really in charge in Germania. A conspiracy began to take root against Rome, which would culminate in a series of conflicts over the next decade, which would be called by later historians the Marcomannic Wars, thusly named for the key conspirators of the conflict. The Marcomanni would face the same battle Etrusci had faced 150 years prior in convincing tribes to join in on their conspiracy. There just wasn't a ton of interest or benefit, really, in making an enemy of an empire which appeared to have overwhelming force. Not to mention, many tribes and tribal elites had grown wealthy from trade with Rome. Nonetheless, a loose coalition of tribes led by the Marcomanni did begin to take shape. They began to plan to strike the Romans at different places at different times in order to give the appearance that they were separate actors moving against Rome rather than an organized, concerted effort. The first invasion started around 167 AD and was really just to test the waters. A small Germanic tribe known as the Langobards encroached into the empire around Pannonia, which is modern-day Austria, and burned several settlements to the ground. This invasion comprised of a relatively small amount of warriors. However, they proved to be quite troublesome for the Romans to corral on their own. The Romans, still unaware of a greater conspiracy against them, went to the Marcomanni to help broker a peace deal to help maintain peace in Pannonia. Instead, the Marcomanni went back to the other tribes and used Romans' passivity for conflict to drum up even more war fervor with the tribes. Many of the other tribes, which had not originally joined the conspiracy, began to realize the Roman dam holding back a Germanic flood had cracks in it, which were now leaking. While the Romans believed they were making progress towards a peace deal with the Langobards, another tribe struck further east at the important Roman gold mines in Dacia, near modern-day Romania. Unlike the Langobards, these tribes were much better organized and were a formidable invasion force. They quickly overwhelmed the local Romans and even captured the local Roman governor and then executed him. This was an embarrassment to the empire, but also a testament to the ferocity with which the Germans moved against the legions. The empire during this conflict was lucky to have been led by one of its most competent leaders, and someone who is widely regarded as one of the greatest emperors of all time, Marcus Aurelius. He would personally lead a large response force against these incursions in the east, in the hopes of deterring future Germanic tribes from invading the empire. However, the Germans were already emboldened by the success of their contemporaries and began to join the Marcomannic conspiracy. When Marcus Aurelius and his forces reached the Dacian frontier, the Marcomanni released their trap, revealing their treachery and swarming into Rome's undefended flank and directly into the heart of the empire. After crossing the Danube, the Marcomanni were met by a hastily conscripted Roman relief army from Italy. The Roman army was quickly encircled and destroyed completely. Reports say that the Romans lost 3 legions, or around 15,000 men, and these were losses they simply could not afford. While we don't have as many sources about this battle, it was certainly a terrifying event for the empire. While many battles such as Teutoburg took place in a faraway forest, this one took place right outside of Italy. With the Roman army now out of the way, the Marcomanni moved quickly onto the Italian peninsula. In a sign of things to come, the horde of Germanic tribes made great use of Roman roads to quickly move throughout Italy. This conflict, which had begun on the periphery of the Roman world, quickly became a crisis of existential proportions for the empire. While many future Roman emperors would prove to be incompetent and would most likely have folded under such pressure, Marcus Aurelius proved to thrive under it. Not one to sit on his hands idly, he began peace talks immediately with the Germanic tribes who were raiding Dacia and gave them a very generous peace offer. This allowed him to quickly pivot his legions to reinforce Italy. The Marcomanni, having trouble sieging the larger cities of Italy and hearing of the legion's return, prudently retreated back to the relative safety of Germania. Given a little breathing room, the Romans prepared a punitive expedition into Germania to deal with the traitorous Marcomanni and their loose coalition of co-conspirators. After all, many of the tribes which had invaded Rome had been allies or trade partners of the empire. After nearly 2 years of planning, the Romans prepared to cross the Danube into Germania with one of the largest expeditionary forces ever assembled in the classical era. Unfortunately for posterity, little is known about this expedition, which again may be why these wars are often overlooked despite their historical importance. However, there are a few pieces of media which depict this often forgotten conflict. One story of this great expedition, which has penetrated the fog of time, is an event called the Miracle of the Rain, which comes to us through a mosaic on a column commissioned from Marcus Aurelius' reign. It tells the story of how the Roman army under Aurelius was saved from complete destruction while campaigning in Germania. The story goes that Marcus Aurelius and his legions were entrapped and encircled by the Marcomanni and their allies. Worse yet for the Romans, it was in the heat of the summer and their supplies were dwindling. Their water supply ran out and the men became so dehydrated they could neither fight nor did they have the energy to retreat. All hope appeared to be lost as the Marcomanni and their allies dug in and the legionaries awaited their fate. Suddenly, clouds began to gather and a great storm swept through. Rain began to pour down and the desperate Romans attempted to catch the rain any way they could, with their shields or helmets, or even just keeping their mouths open and upturned towards the sky. The Marcomanni saw that so many of the Romans were so busy drinking water that they had failed to continue to man their lines. They took advantage of the distracted Romans and broke through the front lines of the Roman camp. Once again, it appeared that all was lost for Aurelius' legions. But then a great hailstorm began to fall, and lightning began to strike the earth. And if one is to believe the full story, the hail and lightning only struck the charging Germans and even destroyed the German siege equipment. The Marcomanni feared they were no longer just facing the Roman army, but the wrath of the gods, and they soon fell into complete disarray. The Romans took advantage of this miraculous situation and turned it into a complete victory. It's interesting to note that contemporary sources of the time all found the miracle of the rain to be of some divine intervention, but disagreed on whose god was to exonerate for this miracle. Most believed it was one of the pagan gods, but at least one source claimed it was the Christian god, as at least one of the legions of the time were of the budding Christian faith. And like their fellow compatriots, they had prayed to their own god for salvation. What's lived out through the contemporary sources is that depending on one's own faith was what one also believed caused the miracle. It's important to note this because at least some Christians felt it was their god, and this gave their religion credibility for those that believed it had been divine intervention. Following this victory, the campaign turned quickly in the Roman favor. They subjugated the Marcomanni and their fellow conspirators. A brief revolt some years later would conclude these Marcomannic Wars, and the Marcomanni would never again reach the same level of prominence in the German world. The Marcomannic Wars show us that the German tribes had grown stronger and were an even greater threat to the stability and future of the empire. Trade and continued contact with the Romans had allowed the Germans to become more civilized and more capable. Despite these advances, individual tribes would still never stand a chance against Rome. However, it did show that when they were able to unite their forces, they provided a much more formidable foe. This was doubly true as Rome became more and more fractured through political infighting. After this war and for the remainder of its existence, the Roman Empire stationed nearly half of their entire legionary force along their extensive border with Germania, from the Rhine River in the north to the Danube in the east. Rome also learned through this conflict that the price of a continued peace along this extensive border was going to have a steep cost, as failure to upkeep this border or prevent another future German coalition may cause the destruction of the empire. And while this would have been a huge bureaucratic strain, It's not like the Romans were headed for some type of incredibly long, sustained, unstable period. The reign of Marcus Aurelius was the twilight of the empire's golden age. Roughly 50 years after his death, the Roman Empire entered a period of great unrest called by later historians the crisis of the 3rd century, in which the entire empire nearly collapsed on itself. In a nutshell, the empire fragmented due to a series of succession crises. Additional claimants to the throne created a cyclical effect which diminished the emperor's legitimacy and the overall power of the empire. Many civil wars ensued, pitting Roman family versus Roman family, city against city, tens of thousands of citizens and legionnaires against one another. Many dying, being maimed, losing everything for powerful men's egos. These internal conflicts removed the economic and military fabric that bound the peoples of the empire together. The Roman Empire that emerged from this crisis would be significantly different from the one that had entered it. At the close of the crisis, the Emperor Diocletian figured that the Roman Empire was just too big for one individual to rule. He created a system in which the empire would be divided into various subsections, ruled by separate rulers who could better respond to local political units. But instead of creating separate empires, these rulers would have their own spheres of influence. The greater empire would forever be bound by an alliance between these entities. They agreed to help one another in all things, especially through conflicts. This new alliance system would become the future divide between the western and eastern halves of the Roman Empire. This plan to have a division of rulers who would help each other sounds great in theory, but it was, in my opinion, wishful thinking, and nothing but a temporary solution. Depending on your viewpoint, these reforms by Diocletian either saved the empire or destroyed it, allowing the West to crumble within 200 years, or allowing the East to prosper and live on for another millennia. There are various historical opinions on this matter. However, the reforms of Diocletian did not help better protect the empire from external threat. Furthermore, it did not prevent future Roman civil wars. With additional emperors, there came additional claimants to each throne, and it didn't always come from the same bloodline. Increasingly, emperors were former generals who would usurp the rightful claimants. Increasingly, the wars in the empire were no longer on the borders, but instead came from within it. These civil wars were costly to the state treasury, but another major issue that arose was that the Romans could no longer find men to fill their legions, with them killing each other and whatnot. Roman armies began to increasingly rely on conscripting Germanic mercenaries into their armies to get an edge in the battlefield. They would hire tribes to come into the empire and fight against other barbarians or fight against other Germanic tribes. And oftentimes, these Germanic mercenaries would often be used to fight against other Roman armies during their many numerous Roman civil wars. So what we get is Roman armies made up of men throughout the empire and mercenaries along the empire's borders, fighting other Roman armies made up of the same groups. This really loosened the definition for many of whom or what is exactly defending the empire and what is trying to destroy it. Who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? What is Roman and what is barbarian? During one civil war, a junior emperor named Constantine won a stunning victory against his co-emperor at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. This battle had such a profound impact on the entire world and has to be mentioned because it starts to set into motion the Christianization of the Western world. According to sources, Constantine received a vision before this battle in which he saw a religious sign of Chi and Rho put together. Chi Rho is Greek for Christo or to Christ. Along with receiving this symbol, he heard in this vision that by this symbol you will conquer. The impact Christianity has had on world history, European history, and specifically German history is, well, quite profound. So we're going to have to cover that in another episode. For today, just know that it began to spread throughout the empire and into the Germanic tribes as well. Even with this shared faith, the continued contact through trade, and shared camaraderie as soldiers in arms, the Romans and Germans could not integrate well together. The Germans lived a simple life. Its leaders favored martial abilities. The Romans, on the other hand, especially Roman elite, lived a very decadent lifestyle afforded to them by the extreme wealth of the empire. Many Romans would have viewed themselves as above many of the positions that Germans were taking, especially in the military, which by the time of the late empire was not viewed as a noble undertaking but fit for civilized Romans anymore. Roman society favored the arts and those with shrewd political prowess. Those of German descent were seen as unable to understand the sophistication of such endeavors and were thus considered to be less than second-class citizens. They viewed Germans as little more than chattel or necessary animals for upkeep of the empire. And what we begin to see is that Rome is becoming weak, and it's becoming complacent. Two seeds sowed which the Romans would eventually reap. Next time, we will finally see the dissolution of the Roman Empire, which happened slowly at first, and then all at once. And in the ashes of this empire, a new world will arise, a distinctly Germanic one.